Hey guys, tonight we're going to do something a little different. Instead of diving into dusty scrolls or temple corridors, we're taking a weary traveler's road into medieval Europe, where the inn smelled faintly of wood smoke, damp cloaks, and whatever was bubbling in the big pot over the fire. And yes, the big reveal. There were no spoons. Imagine walking all day through mud, dodging the occasional suspicious-looking bandit, only to collapse at a table and realize you've got soup, but nothing to scoop it with. You'd probably last about 3 minutes before begging the innkeeper for Uber Eats. Honestly, you wouldn't survive a night in these places, let alone a week. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge along a dirt road, boots caked with mud, the kind that sticks and pulls at your ankles, as if the earth itself doesn't want to let you go. A mist curls low across the fields, and your stomach growls, louder than the distant church bell, announcing vespers. At last ahead, a faint glow of firelight spills from a crooked wooden building, the inn. Its roof is sagging like a tired old man's shoulders, and the shutters rattle in the evening breeze. But to you, it's paradise. You smell stew before you even step inside. Onions, cabbage, maybe some scraps of meat if luck's on your side. The door creaks as you push it open, and a wave of heat and noise washes over you. Travelers crowd the benches, some in heavy wool cloaks still dripping with rain, others with swords clattering against the table legs. A dog sleeps underfoot, ignoring the stomping boots, while a cat perches smugly near the hearth, clearly waiting for a share of supper. You shuffle closer, drawn to the sight of a huge iron pot steaming on the fire. The innkeeper ladles out portions into rough wooden bowls, sliding them down the table like a bartender with tankards. But here's the catch. When you sit down, the bowl is hot, the steam curls into your face, and you realize there's no spoon waiting for you. Around you, others don't seem bothered. They tilt the bowls directly to their lips, sipping loudly, unbothered by splashes dribbling into their beards. Some tear chunks of hard, stale bread and dunk it straight into the broth, soaking up as much liquid as possible before cramming it into their mouths. It's communal, messy, and strangely efficient. You hesitate, glancing at your neighbors, then mimic them. Bread in hand, dunk, slurp, chew. Warmth spreads through your chest, not just from the soup, but from the rhythm of it all. You're part of the crowd now, part of the ritual. And yes, it's awkward. Soup dribbles down chins. Bowls clatter against the wood. A drunk laughs when he spills half his portion onto his tunic. But no one complains. After all, spoons are a luxury here, not standard issue. Metal spoons exist, sure, but most peasants can't afford them, and inns aren't about pampering guests. They're about filling bellies. You realize this isn't a flaw in the system. This is the system. A spoonless dinner, slurped straight from the bowl, was just how things were done. The fire crackles, throwing shadows onto the beams above. You listen to the mix of sounds, the slosh of broth, the crunch of bread, the occasional cough, the mutter of travelers swapping stories about flooded roads and thieves hiding in forest. The air is thick with wood smoke and boiled cabbage, not exactly appetizing by modern standards, but comforting after a long march in the cold. Your eyelids droop a little with the heat, your stomach finally soothed, though you can't help but chuckle. Who knew dinner could feel like a competition between you and your own bowl? As the night deepens, you realize something else. This simple act, drinking soup without a spoon, is more than necessity. It's a reminder of how people adapt, how hunger turns even stale bread into a prized utensil. And somewhere in the corner, a scribe might have once noted these details, though historians today still argue about how common spoonless dining really was. What's certain is that here, tonight, in this smoky inn, you're living it. And you wonder, would you manage to Get through the whole meal without spilling soup down your front? Probably not. But at least you'd fit right in. The bowl is warm in your hands, almost too hot to touch, but you clutch it anyway because the smell is too tempting to resist. You tilt it carefully, the broth sliding toward your lips, and you finally understand why the inn feels alive. It isn't just the fire or the laughter. It's the way everyone is united in this single, ridiculous ritual of eating soup without spoons. The room hums like a beehive, and you're one of the bees now, wings sticky with broth. You look around. On your left, a merchant with a pouch of coins slung at his belt tilts his bowl so far back you're half sure he'll drown in it. He gulps, smacks his lips, and tears another hunk of bread, the crust breaking with a satisfying crunch. On your right, a soldier in rusty mail armor dunks bread into the pot itself, ignoring the muttered protests from others who'd been hoping for a fair share. Nobody fights him, though. He's got a dagger in plain view. And besides, what's a little backwash between friends? This is communal dining at its peak. You can almost hear the inn itself sigh with relief as the bowls clink against the table, in unison. It's messy, yes. Bits of cabbage float on the floor. Dogs scramble to snatch the scraps, and someone sneezes so hard their soup sloshes onto their neighbor's lap. But no one curses. Instead, the neighbor just shrugs, wipes his tunic with the back of his hand, and keeps drinking. Hygiene, you realize, was not exactly the star of the show. You think of modern restaurants with their pristine silverware, polished until it gleams. Here, the only sparkle is the firelight glinting off grease stains. You can't help but laugh inwardly. Imagine a Yelp review. Great atmosphere, hearty soup, only lost 30% of it to my beard. Would recommend. And yet, in its own chaotic way, it works. Everyone leaves warmer and fuller than when they arrived. You lean in closer to the pot. The broth is thin but flavorful. Onions, maybe a turnip or two, and, if the innkeeper was generous, a scrap of pork bones simmered for hours. It's not exactly gourmet, but after trudging through muck all day, this is luxury. The bread does its job, soaking up what the bowl can't deliver directly. You chew slowly, aware that the crusts scrape against your teeth like little chisels. Still, it beats gnawing on raw grain or whatever you might have carried in your pack. And then, inevitably, the drama begins. Across the table, two men reach for the same chunk of bread resting by the pot. Their fingers brush, one growls, the other snorts, and for a moment, you expect fists to fly. But just then, the innkeeper slams down another tray of bread heels, and the tension melts as quickly as butter on hot stone. Crisis averted. It's almost comedic, bread diplomacy at its finest. One traveler whispers to you, "Always eat fast here, or you'll be left with broth and no bread." You glance down at your bowl, suddenly aware of how precious each chunk really is. Bread isn't just food tonight. It's a tool, a sponge, a lifeline. In this world without spoons, it's as important as the broth itself. You wonder if modern archaeologists ever really understood that. That bread wasn't just baked, it was wielded. And yet the strangeness doesn't end there. A drunkard at the far end of the table tries using his dagger as a makeshift spoon. He scoops up some broth, tilts it carefully, and, of course, spills it all down his tunic. The room erupts in laughter, and he grins through the mess. "Close enough," he bellows. The cat near the hearth twitches its tail, unimpressed as, though silently judging the entire affair. Your own bowl is almost empty now, and you feel a surprising sense of accomplishment. Soup without spoons sounded absurd at first, but here you are, stomach full, fingers sticky, and dignity mostly intact. You've joined the ranks of countless medieval travelers who ate the same way, long before forks and polished cutlery made their way into daily life. Historians still debate whether inns always operated like this, or if spoons were simply too costly to hand out. But watching the camaraderie around you, you suspect the truth is simpler. This wasn't inconvenience. It was tradition. And as you set your bowl down with a satisfied sigh, you notice the rhythm of the room hasn't faltered. More bowls are filled, more bread is torn, and the laughter rolls on like a river. For a fleeting moment, you wonder if modern office cafeterias work this way. Would people get along better? Or would HR be buried in soup-related complaints? You shake the thought away, leaning back on the bench. The fire crackles, bellies fill, and for the first time all day, you feel like part of something bigger. No spoons, no problem, just the warm, messy heartbeat of a medieval inn. The laughter fades just enough for you to hear the creak of benches and the shuffle of boots on straw-covered floors. The inn is settling into its rhythm, and with that rhythm comes the unspoken rules, an etiquette so peculiar you wouldn't find it in any written law. But you'd better follow it unless you enjoy soup splashed onto your lap. You lean forward, elbows on the table, and suddenly you realize this meal isn't just about filling stomachs. It's a performance, a dance with rules older than the stains on the inn's rafters. First, there's the rule of rank. You don't need a crown or crest here. But if you've got a coin purse heavier than your neighbor's, you'll find your bowl filled sooner, your bread bigger. The innkeeper's ladle seems magically drawn to the travelers who tip generously. You, on the other hand, might find yourself waiting while others scoop greedily. It feels unfair, but then again, this is the Middle Ages. Fairness is a modern luxury, like Wi-Fi and ergonomic chairs. Next, there's the bread rule. Every chunk of bread doubles as your utensil, so the trick is tearing pieces the right size. Too small, and they crumble into the soup like sad confetti. Too big, and you risk dunking half your hand along with it, which earns you a few disgusted looks. And if your bread falls into the pot completely, congratulations, you've just made medieval croutons for everyone. And yes, they will all laugh at you. Then comes the order of eating. The inn has no posted guidelines, but the system is obvious. The older travelers go first. Not out of respect, mind you, but because no one wants to argue with a man who's survived 5 winters on the road and still has all his teeth. After them, the soldiers take their turn. Partly because of their swords, partly because no one wants to risk soup seasoned with spit from an annoyed knight. Merchants and peddlers follow, muttering about fairness while still sneaking the better pieces of carrot from the pot. At the bottom of the pecking order are the apprentices and stragglers, those without coin or name, left to scrape broth from the bottom. It strikes you as oddly democratic in its own crooked way. Everyone eats, eventually, but the soup itself is like a medieval Wi-Fi signal, strongest for those nearest the source, weakest for those at the far end of the bench. You glance toward a boy seated a few places down. His bread is so thin and stale that when he dips it into the soup, it dissolves almost instantly, leaving him holding nothing but soggy mush. He shrugs, scoops it into his mouth, and grins as though that's just the way things are. You chuckle softly. Kids adapt. Maybe he's onto something. And then there are the silent rules about sharing. You notice how the man across from you tears off a chunk of bread, dips it, then passes the rest to his companion. No words exchanged, just the quiet understanding that survival often depends on generosity. But just as quickly, another traveler snatches bread straight from the table with zero concern for politeness. You realize the line between courtesy and chaos is as thin as the broth itself. At one point, a woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper tongue slaps the wrist of a man who dared dip twice. "One dunk, one bite," she scolds, her voice like a whip. The man laughs nervously, pulls his hand back, and the table erupts with nods of approval. Apparently, double dipping was a crime, long before party etiquette books existed. Historians would later argue about whether these rules were consistent across Europe or unique to each inn, but sitting here now, you can see why such customs mattered. Without them, this place would dissolve into soup-fueled anarchy. The longer you watch, the more you realize how ritualized it all feels. This isn't just dining, it's survival theater. Bread as spoon, soup as stage, travelers as actors. Everyone knows their role, even if no one speaks it aloud. And you, a newcomer, are slowly being absorbed into the play. Your thoughts drift as you slurp quietly, and you can't help but smirk. Imagine if modern boardrooms adopted the bread rule. Sorry, Johnson, your report was sloppy. No soup for you until you fix it. Or maybe university cafeterias, where students duel over the last crust of bread. Chaos, yes, but perhaps more honest than polite murmurs over silver cutlery. As the night deepens, you notice the rules extend beyond the table. When the soup pot is finally scraped clean, the bowls are stacked, not washed, because washing is tomorrow's problem. Dogs leap up to lick the wooden table clean, cats prowl for scraps, and no one seems disturbed. In fact, the innkeeper nods approvingly. Less work for him. And as you lean back, belly warm, you realize that these strange, unwritten rules aren't about the soup at all. They're about holding chaos at bay, about making sure travelers from dozens of villages can share one pot without stabbing each other. It's messy, it's absurd, and yet it works. You wipe your mouth with your sleeve, your medieval napkin, and sigh. The broth has vanished, but the memory of it lingers, along with the realization that tonight, in this cramped, smoky room, you've witnessed not just dinner, but the choreography of survival. And if that choreography required a few soggy bread spoons along the way, well, better than nothing. The benches creak again as travelers shift, and this time it's not for soup, but for stories. With bellies half filled and breadcrumbs clinging to their sleeves, the real entertainment begins. You lean back, wiping a streak of broth from your chin, and realize that this smoky room is about to transform into a stage. The flicker of the fire becomes the spotlight, and the travelers themselves are the actors, weaving tales to distract from the fact that most of the soup tasted like someone rinsed vegetables in hot water and called it dinner. The first voice that rises belongs to a merchant with a red face and a belly that strains his tunic. He's halfway through a mug of ale, which means his tongue is looser than his belt. He launches into a story about a caravan ambushed by bandits, only to reveal that the bandits fled not because of swords, but because the soup they'd stolen was so revolting that even starving men couldn't choke it down. The table erupts in laughter, spoons, or rather bread crusts, slapping the table like applause. Across the room, a soldier leans forward, his armor clinking softly. He has the gravelly voice of someone who has chewed on iron nails for breakfast. He insists he's eaten soup so salty on campaign that it could pickle a horse. His comrades nod knowingly, adding their own variations. Soup made of leather boiled soft enough to chew. Soup so thin you could see your reflection in it. You can't help but chuckle. Clearly, medieval soldiers were connoisseurs of disappointment. But then the stories shift, as they always do, toward the ridiculous. A peddler with crooked teeth claims he once saw a cat lick the soup pot before anyone else touched it, and the innkeeper pretended not to notice. "Adds flavor," the peddler cackles, while the table groans in mock horror. You glance at the innkeeper, who shrugs as if to say, "What can you do? Cats run the place anyway." And you have to admit, considering the way the tabby at your feet eyes your bread, he might be right. What fascinates you most is how everyone listens. Even the gruffest soldier quiets down when a story reaches its peak, eyes glinting in the firelight. Laughter rolls like waves, murmurs rise like wind, and the air thickens with the warmth of shared tales. In a world where inns often smelled like damp straw and desperation, stories were the real luxury. Soup filled the stomach, but stories filled the night. A traveler from the coast recounts a tale of a shipwreck where survivors clung to barrels and driftwood. According to him, the first thing they did when they crawled ashore was build a fire and boil seawater with scraps of seaweed. "It was soup," he declares proudly, though half the table boos and jeers that brine doesn't count. You laugh too, imagining a medieval Yelp review. "Would not recommend," tastes like ocean with extra ocean. Somewhere between tales of watery broth and half-burnt stews, you realize that humor is survival here. Food may be scarce, journeys long, but laughter makes the soup thicker, the room warmer. You notice how the weary lines on faces soften as chuckles ripple across the benches. Even the boy with the soggy bread from earlier grins, his cheeks flushed from the firelight and the absurdity of it all. Of course, not all stories are cheerful. A scholar-looking man, his hair wild as though he's been at war with parchment, mutters about a famine year. He recalls whole villages scraping pots so clean they shone, praying for rain, trading prayers for soup that never came. The room hushes for a moment, the laughter dimming. You feel the weight of it settle into your chest, the reminder that not every night ends in a full belly. Yet the silence doesn't linger too long. Someone cracks a joke about a pot of soup so thin that a fly drowned from despair, and the laughter surges back. That's the thing about these inns. Sorrow has its place, but it never stays long. Historians still debate just how accurate these travelers' tales were. Were the soups truly as dreadful as described, or were these stories simply medieval stand-up comedy, exaggerations born of boredom and ale? You can almost picture a historian in a dusty library frowning at a record that reads, "Soup tasted of boots," and wondering whether it was literal or just a joke passed down too far. As the stories pile on, you notice how the inn transforms into something larger than itself. The smoky rafters might as well be a vaulted ceiling, the worn benches a noble stage. And every clumsy joke, every exaggeration about soup too salty or soup licked by cats, becomes part of a shared mythology. This inn is not just a place to eat, it's a place to remember, to laugh, to anchor the endless road in something familiar. You find yourself lulled not just by the broth in your stomach, but by the rhythm of voices. One tale blends into the next, a steady current of humor and humanity. The crackle of the fire, the groan of benches, the low hum of voices, it all becomes a lullaby of sorts. And in that lull, you realize you've stepped into something timeless. The way humans, weary from travel and burden, make sense of their world not with feasts or monuments, but with stories told over spoonless soup. Your eyes grow heavy for a moment, your chin dipping toward your chest, and you almost miss the punchline of a tale about a monk who tried to bless a soup pot, only to discover it held nothing but boiling water. The table roars, the fire flares, and you blink awake, smiling. You're not alone here. You're part of the story now, too. The fire pops again, sparks rising like tiny prayers, and you notice the shift in tone. The jokes about salty broth and cat-licked pots fade into something more curious, more peculiar. Tonight you've stumbled not only into stories but into truths stranger than fiction, and these truths cling to the edges of the benches like shadows. You hear the clink of mugs, the shuffle of boots, and the quiet murmur of a tale passed along not for laughter, but for marvel. One gray-bearded clerk leans forward, his voice low and deliberate, as if speaking of secrets. He explains that in some inns, spoons weren't simply missing. They were replaced with stale bread, hardened so tough it could double as both scoop and chew. The guests would tear off chunks, dip them into the communal pot, and slurp soup-soaked bread until nothing remained. By the end, the spoons themselves became the meal. You imagine a medieval waiter announcing proudly, "Your cutlery is edible. No extra charge." In some ways, it sounds genius. In others, desperately sad. Beside him, a woman with hair tucked beneath a fraying scarf adds her own truth. In poorer towns, she says, soup was served so thick that it required no spoon at all. People simply broke it apart with fingers, like a stew that forgot it wanted to be liquid. Once, she whispers, the pot was so heavy with porridge that we carved it with knives. You blink, realizing she isn't joking. Soup you. Can carve? That's not soup. That's bread in denial. You lean closer, intrigued, as the clerk explains how cheese rinds often served as makeshift ladles. Thick and curved, they scooped broth well enough, and when the meal ended, the rind was gnawed away, leaving nothing to wash. Economical, efficient, and slightly gross if you think about sharing it with 20 strangers. You almost laugh, but the hush around the table keeps you quiet. These aren't stories meant for punchlines. They're records of endurance. Someone mutters about sleeves. Yes, sleeves. When broth dripped, when chunks fell, when bread failed, people wiped and dipped with woolen sleeves, as if the cloth itself were a utensil. You glance at your own sleeve, imagining it reeking of onions for months, and grimace. Historians still argue whether that detail was exaggerated. Surely no one dipped sleeves directly into soup, right? And yet, in this smoky inn, with broth, sloshing on every bench, it doesn't seem impossible. Perhaps practicality outweighed dignity when hunger pressed hard enough. The room grows thoughtful. Mugs are lifted slower now, stories quieter. You realize you're not hearing jokes anymore, but lessons, whispered reminders of just how far humans will stretch to fill their bellies. Soup without spoons isn't funny when the bread is hard as stone, when cheese rinds are the only tool, when sleeves do double duty. It's survival dressed in broth. And still, amid the gravity, humor sneaks in. A young traveler boasts that he once carved a bread spoon so fine that a lord mistook it for wood. He grins, insisting that when the soup was finished, he ate the wooden spoon, just to prove his skill. The table chuckles, though the older faces shake their heads as if to say, youth can laugh at hunger. We remember when it bit too deeply. You hear whispers, too, about spoons being withheld on purpose. Some inns, it's said, never bothered to provide utensils, knowing full well that travelers would bring their own. And if they didn't? Too bad. Eat with bread, drink from the bowl, or go hungry. It was less about kindness, more about control. One more way to remind guests that inns were businesses, not homes. Soup was never charity. It was currency. What fascinates you is how all these strange truths blur the line between necessity and choice. Was bread as spoon clever innovation, or proof of poverty? Were cheese rinds practical tools, or the last resort of the desperate? Historians still debate it, of course. The records leave only fragments. A scribbled account of bread spoons in one parish, a monk's complaint about soup stains on sleeves. Scholars frown at these scraps, unsure whether to treat them as evidence of clever thrift or grim deprivation. You, though, you sit in the inn and see it clearly. It's both. Hunger breeds invention, and invention often tastes like compromise. You picture the families who laughed about bread spoons, turning necessity into a game, while others clenched, their teeth in scraped sleeves raw because nothing else remained. The truth of soup without spoons is layered, like the broth itself. Sometimes thin, sometimes rich, never quite the same twice. The fire gutters, and the mood softens. A woman hums a tune low and steady, almost like a lullaby, and her cat, yes, another cat, pads onto the bench beside her, curling against her side. She breaks off a crust, dips it in the broth, and offers it absently to the animal, who licks it clean. You smile faintly, realizing that cats, too, were part of this spoonless ritual. They always are. Your stomach feels heavier now, not just with soup, but with the weight of these truths. The smoky air settles on your skin. The warmth of the crowd presses against your shoulders, and you sense the story is bending toward something deeper still. The laughter has softened into reflection, the clatter into quiet. You lean back, eyelids dipping, thinking, spoons or not, history always leaves its marks, in broth stains, in bread crusts, in paw prints pressed faintly against memory. And in that thought, you realize the night isn't quite finished. There's one more turn, one more descent into the hush of the medieval inn. Sleep edges closer, but first, The fire will dim, and with it, the last stories of soup. The fire has burned down to embers now, glowing red like the last heartbeat of the room, and the chatter has slowed into murmurs so soft you can hardly tell if they're words or just the sighing of tired lungs. You're still at the table, though. The benches creak less as people drift toward their sleeping mats in the loft above. The soup pot is nearly empty, just a thin sheen of broth clinging to its sides, reflecting the faint flicker of candlelight. And beside you, your own belly feels warm, stretched, steady, not from abundance, but from the simple act of eating among others, spoonless though it was. You notice the bureaucratic clerk who lectured earlier about bread spoons has dozed off against the wall, scrolls sliding from his lap. A merchant snores softly, chin tucked into his chest, while a child whimpers in her sleep before settling again. And in the silence, the cats prowl. One leaps gracefully onto the table, nose deep in the cooling pot, while another pads between. Sleeping bodies, tail brushing cheeks like a soft broom. No one stirs. It's as if they belong as much to this inn as the smoke-stained beams and the sagging roof. The night air presses through a gap in the shutters. It carries with it the scent of damp earth, of distant stables, of horses shifting in their sleep. You can almost hear the river in the distance, slow and constant, like the breath of the land itself. And wrapped in this soundscape, the inn feels like a cradle, not grand, not clean, but safe enough for tonight. The kind of safety where even hunger, even the absurdity of soup without spoons, feels softened by the company of others. You lean your head against the table, cheek resting on your folded arm, and your body sinks into the rhythm of the room. Boots scuffed against wood, mugs stacked in sloppy towers, the steady purring of cats. It all blends into a lullaby. Your own breath slows to match it, heavier now, deeper. And as your eyes flutter, you realize the strangest truth of all. The spoon never mattered. What mattered was the warmth, the fire, the voices humming like waves. The soup was only an excuse to gather, to anchor weary travelers in the long stretch of night. A thought drifts through your mind, half-formed but comforting. Perhaps this is why the practice endured. Bread spoons, cheese rinds, sleeves dipped. Into broth. They weren't just improvisations. They were rituals, tiny acts of resilience that said, "We will eat together, no matter what we lack." And the historians still argue. Was it desperation or convenience? But here, in the hush of the inn, the debate seems irrelevant. The truth is both, and neither. It is simply life, lived one bowl at a time. The embers glow dimmer. Shadows stretch longer. The laughter that once filled the hall has thinned into nothing but the occasional cough, the soft shifting of a dreamer on the floor. You close your eyes, still hearing echoes. A slurp of soup, a bread crust cracking, a cat's meow that no one dared hush. They swirl together like a fading song, fragments of a history too ordinary to write down, and yet too human to forget. Your breath deepens. You see the images soften at their edges, blurring like ink in water. The long tables, the shared bowls, the sleeves stained dark with broth. Then even those begin to dissolve, leaving only warmth, only rhythm, only the sound of purring, steady and endless, lulling you farther down. The inn fades, but its comfort lingers. You imagine the cats curling at your feet, the bread crusts tucked safely away, the soup pot shining faintly in the corner. And then even those fall quiet. The night stretches over you like a blanket, heavy and soft, and you feel yourself sink. The story thins to a whisper now, words barely clinging to meaning, their edges drifting away like smoke. You are safe here. You are warm, You are carried, gently by the hum of history, by the weight of countless nights just like this one, by the memory of soup without spoons, and the laughter it somehow inspired. And as your breath slows, eyelids sinking shut, the voice itself dims until it is almost gone. End of script. Sweet dreams.